And now we are going to talk about the art of conservation. And I wanted to bring in a piece that was worked on by a number of our visitors today with Bonnie Acker, who is so pleased that our next speaker, John Elder, has given us the quote, she says, that will galvanize us all for the next 25 years. A dialogue between wildness and culture is what we need now. So I believe our visitors felt very strongly the same way. It's really an honor for me to introduce John Elder, Professor Emeritus, retired from Middlebury College. He first joined the faculty there in 1973. His original appointment was in English, followed by a split appointment in English and American literature and in environmental studies. And he was ultimately appointed just a college professor. And what strikes me so wonderfully about all of the conversations this afternoon is how multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary they've all been, and how thoughtful all of you as participants and all of our speakers have been thinking about this topic of place and land in such a wonderful kaleidoscopic way. John Elder's special areas of interest are, for those of us from Vermont we know well, are in American nature writing, English Romantic poetry, modern American poetry of nature. His three most recent books, Reading the Mountains of Home, The Frog Run, and Pilgrimage to Vallombrosa, have each combined discussion of literature, description of Vermont's landscape and natural history, and personal memoir. And I am really pleased to welcome John Elder to the podium.
It's such a pleasure to participate in this symposium. It's a feast, really. My head's buzzing, and my heart is whatever hearts do, swimming, I suppose. With all the things I've heard, the brilliant talks, I thought, by Thor and Donna. And I also need to acknowledge that when I was asked to write a little piece that's called Confluence for the exhibit, I sent it by Thor as a certified geologist, and he saved me from at least one howler and a couple of minor embarrassments. So thanks for that. And I also so appreciated Susan and Brian and Cami and Gowrie for their really, I thought, totally absorbing presentations and a really bold discussion. I liked the fact that in that discussion we got onto the, by the way, am I close enough to this microphone? Yeah. I like the fact that when we got into that discussion, the question of the loud voice of the artist arose. And it was such a thoughtful response to that perhaps the loudest voice of the artist is not in overt political argumentation, but is in a kind of quiet testimony to the deepest values which motivate us and have the power to restore social health. And I was thinking about that, the quiet power of the artist, because how long ago was it? 7 years that we walked from Ripton, where Frost House was, to Burlington, a 5-day walk to draw attention to climate issues in Vermont, and ended with a big rally. And Cami made a couple of beautiful panels on a kind of diaphanous material. Diaphanous, it sounds like kind of a pornographic word, doesn't it? But and these were actually, yeah. But they were pictures of cedar waxwings in a kind of against a faint yellow, and they were walked along with us on the march like banners. Really, we were walking behind them, and then they would be posted, and we would walk through them as through gates. It was so powerful, such an important part of that. I also wanted to express, in addition to my real pleasure and excitement about the program, my gratitude to Shelburne Museum and Vermont Land Trust for bringing together in a collaborative way this exhibition of 14 Vermont artists working in a group of farms and forests conserved by VLT. This kind of dialogue is, as people have been saying today, how wonderful it is to have conversation that broadens the circle of experience we have with this art. And the same thing is true in the conversation that connects art and conservation. It helps us to incorporate these values into our own lives. But having begun with pleasure and gratitude, now is where the shadow falls across my page, because I feel daunted by my commission today, which is to reflect upon the relationship between art and conservation. This is not an easy topic because, of course, there's not a direct dialogue between art and the land the way there might be between people. There's not the possibility for a reciprocal collaboration of a sort that is possible between two visionary organizations. There is an interchange between art and the land, but it's mysterious. As Susan said, it's unpredictable. It emerges and takes the artist herself by surprise. And the other thing that feels daunting here, but again, I'll do my best with it, is thinking about this mysterious interchange. At the same time, it's so important to honor the embodied and sensory character of artists' works, not to become abstract or overly metaphorical, to make a grounded response that's worthy of their grounded work. So when I'm feeling intellectually insecure and personally awkward, my default is always to tell a story. So I'd like to begin with a narrative. And this is a personal narrative that actually has helped me to think about the topic and to introduce a couple of themes with which I'd like to pursue my reflections. I'll just say, sitting back there and chatting with DJ, he in an interesting, fun conversation mentioned an art critic I don't know named David Carrier, who has stated that discussion of art is a mix of observation and fantasy. And so I thought, since I know I have fantasies, perhaps this story would give me a little bit more observation. So I'd like to tell you a story to start with and to introduce my main themes of a hike I took on the Hogback Ridge in Bristol 3 years ago with my Bristol friend and native, David Bren. This was an outing on a frosty February morning 3 years ago, and it came freshly to mind when I was viewing the works in Eyes on the Land for the first time last week. I realized that my hike was a parallel attempt to cultivate a deep relationship with the Vermont landscape, parallel to what the artists have been doing in their various conserved properties. In this case, the relationship I sought to deepen was with the hills around my wife Rita's and my Bristol home. Furthermore, as I thought about the hike in the context of the exhibition, I realized that two of the factors, one topographical and one ecological, that mapped and organized this little expedition for my friend and me were watersheds, that's the topographical one, and edge effect from the science of ecology. And I think these are the two ideas I would like to use to try to organize my response to this wonderful exhibit and program. It's important, as I say, to honor these artists in their own grounded terms and to register what a resource their work is for individuals and communities desiring a more powerful sense of affiliation with the earth. To bring my hike back into sharp focus now, I need to take my dog-eared U.S. Geological Survey map of the Bristol Quadrangle down from the wall where it usually hangs above my workbench. Reading it closely, I notice that it is heavily seamed from so often being folded into backpacks or jacket pockets. Its formerly white margin is soiled and splotched. The street grid of Bristol is shown in the southeast corner of the map, but its central figure is that dramatic and heavily forested upland called the Hogback Ridge, which runs north-south and rises over 1,000 feet above our village. Hogback is a finger of quartzite about 10 miles long and between 2 and 3 miles across. Glaciation and erosion have stripped away the softer dollo stones that once enclosed it within a higher plateau, sloughing them down to enrich the heavy clays to our west in the Champlain Valley. Hogback thus constitutes a resistant limb of bedrock, and although logged over several times during the last 2 centuries, has never been cultivated or settled. Our house on Mountain Street stands less than a quarter mile from this roadless area that enlivens the village with its wildness. In walking out our back door to an outlook called The Ledges, from which I can look straight down at our house as well as clear across Addison County to Lake Champlain, I pass under a band of broad-branched, open-grown trees where wild turkeys often roost. They venture out to glean on nearby farms in the months between harvest and the coming of the snow. In continuing my uphill hike, I enter thickening woods where evergreens are more prevalent. Deer trace their daily circuits here, bedding down under the hemlocks at night, while moose pass through on their way from the heights to the wetlands at the western edge of town. Farther up the slope comes a broken, rocky scramble of land where bobcats and black bears den. Along with the various discolorations on its margin from tea and peanut butter sandwiches held by fingers shaking from the cold, there are 3 lines drawn onto my map in pencil. One of these traces the ridge of Hogback from the north to its southern terminus at a rugged cliff called Deer Leap, then angles sharply west through the village. All of the land east and south of this line drains into the New Haven River as it runs through Bristol toward its meeting with the northward flow of Otter Creek and its ultimate destination in Lake Champlain. Much of the water washing down to the north and west of the ridge will end up in Lewis Creek, traveling north again through Heinsberg after its detour through Bristol Pond. On a cold afternoon in February, David and I hiked up onto Hogback to figure out where the rest of the precipitation on the ridge ends up. We hope to confirm that there was a fan-shaped wedge of land on Hogback's western slope that intervened between the New Haven and Lewis Creek drainages, ultimately conveying water due west along Plank Road into a tributary of the Little Otter Creek. Tracking the flow of land is an important part of knowing where you live. We climbed up from Mountain Street, passing through a tattery piece of wooded ground just to the south. With the topo map in hand, we hoped to locate a particular little knoll we believed might just be above us to the east. While far short of the height of country, it seemed to be a possible location for the headwater of the Little Otter. We had little success at first, since most of the surface area was frozen into taut skins of ice the size of drumheads, silent and motionless now until we crunched through them in our boots. At one point, though, as we stopped to listen to the world beyond our own motion, we heard a bubbling. A patch of cobbles lay with the looseness of talus just below the place marked hopefully by a penciled X on our map. In our part of Vermont, the temperature of groundwater holds at around 46 degrees Fahrenheit, so that springs can be discovered running in all seasons. This one spilled down into a descending seam of land, establishing a watercourse that did indeed run directly west. Above that point of origin and division was a rugged granite erratic carpeted with common polypody, a robust and abundant fern in the Green Mountains. Kernels of snow from a recent storm nestled among its shriveled but still green fronds. Just upslope from this landmark crossed an icy, treacherous road left over from a recent A. Johnson Company logging operation that had also left a hedge of slash along its track. The boulder we were concentrating on was about 10 feet high and with steep sides, but we managed to scramble atop it. We tossed up a few rocks before making our grand ascent so that we could erect a commemorative cairn on a bare, level area of ferny roof. 3 large flat stones established a statuary base of narrowing circumference, on which I set a rounder and more massive rock. Then we saw that a long tooth of ledge was already waiting for us on the erratic. One side of this triangular piece was cut away in a curve that let it tuck up smoothly beside and over the top of that round stone. It held steady there, a slender tip flickering above the cairn like a gray candle flame. After we had marveled at this providential balancing act, David got out a jar of maple syrup he'd brought along in the pocket of his timber cruiser's vest and dripped some of its dark, viscous contents down the sides of the crowding flame. It collected onto the stones below, but also clung to and ambered the grainy surfaces of the vertical piece. We hoped that some rodent might happen upon this trove of calories and gain a chance to survive another Vermont winter. Well, that was my story. So now to think about it a little bit and try to apply it to what we've experienced in this gallery and in this whole program. Unlike so many counties across the U.S. with their dead straight lines inscribed onto the map indoors with a steel edge, watersheds are observable areas determined by what Gary Snyder calls in his book, The Practice of the Wild, the lineaments of the land. The usage of watershed has evolved, though. Early on, it referred to the way in which ridges and other elevations divide rainfall into streams flowing in different directions. As most people use the word today, though, watershed refers to an enclosed area on the surface of the land, within which streams collect into larger and larger rivers or bodies of water. Here in Vermont, for instance, the Middlebury River flows west from the Green Mountains until it issues from its dramatic gorge through Ripton and East Middlebury and joins the Otter Creek on its own journey to Lake Champlain. Rivulets on the eastern side of the mountains converge with the Mad River. Watersheds can be perceived at different scales, as smaller ones are nested within larger ones. To return to the Middlebury River, the north and south forks of that are both included, finally, in the Middlebury River watershed, and then join with the New Haven watershed in the larger Otter Creek watershed. In turn, that becomes part of the Champlain bioregion, bounded on the west by the Adirondack High Peaks, and with Lake Champlain as its multi-chambered heart. Even that grand watershed flows into a bigger natural zone, though. Running northward through the Richelieu River, it connects to the Laurentian vastness that joins northern New England geologically, biologically, and in many ways also culturally with Quebec and the Maritimes. Catchment is the preferred British term for a unit of the Earth's surface bounded by higher edges and within which springs, rainfall, and smaller tributaries converge, in most cases flowing onward to an outlet that joins it to a more broadly encompassing drainage. I appreciate that image because of its emphasis on the dynamic ingathering within a flow. The Connemara writer Tim Robinson defines a catchment as, and this is his language, an open, self-renewing system supporting and supported by a vast number of life forms and all their interrelations. Even its basic topography, the most skeletal and reductive representation of its geometry, is profoundly suggestive of a way of looking at the world and caring for it. Every point on the Earth's surface is mapped in such a way, by elevations and by the movement of water, as Gary Snyder has written, beginning with attention to our local topography, we finally come to see that the Earth itself is finally a single watershed. As suggested by the last sentence of Robinson's definition, and this is my application to the art, conservation too can be understood as a watershed nested within a larger dynamic reality, a river of cherishing and protecting that grows from the rivulets of our affection for intimately familiar local landscapes. This is one reason that the landscape of watersheds feels so pertinent to me, to the works in this exhibition, as well as to the collaboration between Shelburne Museum and the Vermont Land Trust that have made it a reality. The hikeable scale of conservation projects depicted within this exhibition, as well as their long association with human endeavors and communities, can sharpen our perception of natural dynamics in a way that also fosters a more energetic and inclusive sense of stewardship. I was interested by Susan's remark that the impact of a place on an artist is a slow effect of a certain kind of attentive observation, slow enough that it tends to make artists devoted to particular landscapes. So that's one reason why this experiment, I suppose you could call it, within the collaboration is so interesting and promising, because these are small-scale projects which an artist can come to know in great detail. I think each of the works in this exhibit, not just the lands themselves, can be viewed also as a watershed, framed organically and uniquely in interchange with the lineaments of specific landscapes, yet also flowing outward into what David Abram calls the more than human world. By this phrase, he acknowledges the reality that nature is neither separate nor fully human. It's a larger, inclusive realm within which artists, like scientists, help us to glimpse an organic web of relationships, both sustaining our humanity and extending far, far beyond us. In this exhibition, paintings and photographs are hung on the walls, sometimes framed and sometimes simply set off against the white background. Sculptures are held up for view on shelves and flat surfaces. Films are shown on monitors. The beautiful processes of earth and the record of human interactions with a place over generations are likewise framed, defined, and in a variety of ways illuminated within these works of art. Cami spoke in her remarks just now about the long periods of attentive awareness that work on you. It reminded me of what Thor said earlier about the fact that we have people working in the land and we have the land working on people. There's something, as I said before, it's not exactly a reciprocal collaborative relationship, but it is an interchange nonetheless. I think that alertness to natural processes and patterns is essential to recognizing that the natural phenomena surrounding us are never random. They appear in associations that have their own logic, that tell their own story. They're often especially visible at that scale, the scale of these conserved properties featured in Eyes on the Land. Conservation, I think, might actually even be defined as a process at once localizing and protective. To put this another way, the impulse of stewardship arises from a specific sense of affiliation, a word to which I want to return, and it strengthens our sense of identification and participation. If the works of art in this exhibition are like watersheds, entering at once into the confluence of the show and into the life of our state, they can also be seen as flowing directly from 2 centuries of romantic revolt against centralized, mechanized, and hierarchical views of humanity and the land. This artistic and spiritual reaction arose in the late 18th century in response to the Industrial Revolution and continues to the present day in a continuous lineage, I believe, from Wordsworth and Constable to Emerson and Thoreau, and from those artists and activists to their descendants like Muir, Bierstadt, Adams, O'Keeffe, Leopold, and Carson. The romantic vision of farms and forests as being in the service of both human and more than human communities arises from and requires the perpetual enlivenment of art. I truly believe that. I believe that this romantic revolt against a mechanistic and deadening world requires the perpetual enlivenment of art. Like many, I first encountered the majesty of Yosemite and the sublime beauty of northern New Mexico through the photographs of Ansel Adams and the paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe, respectively. Such artists help me to see more deeply and help the inhabitants of those landscapes dwell more steadily in the land. They represent life-saving antidotes to a rationale assigning value only to what can be bought and sold. Grounding such a vision in the local fosters stewardship in ways that a more abstract appreciation of nature could never do. At the origins of the Romantic Revolt, the essayist William Hazlitt described the essence of Wordsworth's deceptively simple poetry as being, a phrase I love, proud humility. He was humble enough to ground himself in the simple, rural, and relatively impoverished landscape of the Lake District, but from that spot, he claimed the largest relationships between humanity and nature. He had a grand historical vision. Hazlitt went on, Wordsworth took, quoting now, the commonest events and objects as a test to prove that nature's always interesting from its inherent truth and beauty. It's interesting. I was struck when Donna was reading from George Aiken's defense of Vermont's farms, which had been declared submarginal, not viable. Really, as I heard his language, it seemed to me he was making a claim that they were in fact richly marginal. They were on the edge of fields and clearings, unlike the vast agricultural operations of the Midwest, and within such a place where you were at the margin, you were between the cultivated land and the forest, it was possible to feel enriched, to find that your human freedom of thought and action had become both natural and inherent to that place. Well, I think that this kind of an approach resonates not only with the Romantic Revolt, which continues to this day. In fact, it's our only hope. We're all participating in it today. But it also relates to the concept of bioregionalism, as discussed by Kirkpatrick Sale in a book of the same title. As David Abram does, Sale rejects dichotomies, like nature versus culture, specifically. He asserts that by focusing on a local region, community, or farm even, we can see the way in which people and their surroundings both depend upon and influence each other. The geology, climate, seasons, forests, and wildlife of a region inevitably color people's experience of living there. Correspondingly, the character of a specific human community's history, culture, and economy in a particular place can either damage or help to sustain the larger fabric of life on which it depends. The linkage of art to conservation in Vermont reveals the potential for a more stable sense of affiliation with the land. We often these days speak of online or virtual communities, and I have nothing against that way of speaking. It's accurate in capturing the growing importance of digital networking in our world. But the conservation projects and the artistic responses of Eyes on the Land exemplify a much more concrete and expansive experience of humanity, of community. For me, this is in fact one of the most dramatic continuities within the whole collaboration and the exhibition, which is in Alda Leopold's image, its upshot. The Nulheganaki Tribal Forest celebrates and supports the Abenaki people's ancient heritage in Vermont. Just as sugaring is a delightful aspect of the Nulheganaki project, so too is it essential to Butternut Mountain Farm, which is such an important resource for sugar makers both across the state. The Johnson, Harlow, Russell, and Bunker farms, like Champlain Orchards, are similarly both family operations and vital to the sense of place of the people in their surrounding towns. In other words, the meaning of these conservation projects is not simply within the boundaries governed by the conservation easements. It's between the boundaries and the surrounding communities. That's where this rich, reverberant reality comes into being. For people surrounding farms like this to visit them, to purchase food from them, to even just to drive or bike past them on a regular basis enhances the sense of belonging to a landscape. Such an experience is far from virtual, in being neither abstract, filtered through a computer, nor narrowly focused in a closely defined social group. It is a connection on the ground. The Bolton Valley Nordic and backcountry lands supports at once a recreational community and a beautiful forested landscape. There's a kind of doubleness. I was struck looking at Cammie's pictures. I was thinking, gee, each of those fields is divided in two. Very, very interesting. And then she calls them diptychs. I thought, okay, they really are divided in two. And in fact, that sense of the relationship between the adjacent realities. You know, the conserved lands are important far beyond their boundaries. In fact, they're important, you might say, specifically at their boundaries. That's where new vision arises. And I'll move a little faster, but you can see it in all of the projects on which artists worked. Often the larger ones in Orange County, Meadowee, Chateauguay were cooperative. Different land holdings were pooled, and specifically they served, I think in each of those cases, a kind of complementarity between working lands and wild lands. They buffer each other, working lands and wild lands. It's so clear, ecologically speaking, and also economically, that there's a mutual sustainability. The same can be seen in the Pine Island Farm, adding to its equation the desire to support new arrivals in Vermont in big conservation projects like Brewster Uplands and the Virginia Stranahan Memorial Forest and Preston Pond, again, where the focus inside is on preserving wild communities, but the effect, at least as powerfully, is to enrich the experience of their human neighbors. I think that such diversity within the confluence of these conservation projects is mirrored and illuminated in very exciting ways by the richness of art in the exhibit. So many visions in so many media make of the whole exhibition a grand collage. There's something almost zany about it, with all of the media and the emotions and the colors and the forms. It reminded me, when thinking about this talk, of, I don't know if people know Charles Ives's compositions. He was a famously avant-garde musician, but his father was a bandmaster in Connecticut. And what his father loved to do, in ways that seemed to doom his son to compose the kind of pieces he composed, was to take two bands, each playing a different march, and have them go by each other in the middle of the green, so that in the middle, when they're just next to each other, there's a kind of harmony and melody that had never been heard before in New England arising. I felt a kind of a vibrant excitement in this exhibit, in which new possibilities of perception, expression, conservation, and community were really jangling wonderfully in the air around our ears. Now, one advantage of a non-virtual community is that it's rarely homogeneous. Residents in Vermont villages know that you don't get to pick your next-door neighbors. Diverse communities, in fact, though, can resemble a mixed-age, mixed-species forest with greater capacity to raise and maintain an intricate canopy, to sustain a wide variety of wildlife, and to stand up much better than woodlands lacking such diversity when there are invasions by insect pests or new invasives. And they're supported in that by neighbors who eat the invasives as fast as they can. And by the way, if you know this, when you cut Japanese knotweed when it's still fairly small and steam it, it's a kind of asparagus, chewy, but edible. So anyway, the diversity is a factor of forest health, and I think of culture as well. To walk around this exhibition is to experience a similar refreshment from the different angles and media. It's like hiking up onto Hogback on a February day and then returning home to thaw by the fireside and reflect about that experience in a journal entry. It's an experience of contrast value, so available within our surprising little state. The advantage of localized and diverse environmental and aesthetic values relates to the special fertility associated with the other idea I wanted to offer for thinking about this whole program, which is edge effect. Edge effect is what ecologists call what they discover at the borderline between a couple of more or less distinct habitats. At such edges, there tend to be organisms from each of the adjacent environments, as well as some that are exclusive to that edge, so that these liminal zones are often uniquely rich, both in the number of species and in the biotic mass that they produce. Rachel Carson's beloved Rocky Main coastline, as well as our own Vermont, in which trees endlessly encroach upon abandoned meadows and even upon unmowed backyards, illustrate the ways in which edges are always moving too. I was struck again in that panel just now by the painter's comments, the artist's comments about how they were drawn to edges. That interested me. Edges are lively. Edges are exciting. Susan talked about being struck by landscapes where there was a juxtaposition of contrasting landscape values, or a transitional moment in the landscape. Brian worked along edges, whether in the frontage area beside a freeway where he was subversively encouraging people to plant flowers, or in the area around a university building where with a couple of authoritative signs, all mowing stopped. Cami, as I've already said, not only divided her paintings, but juxtaposed them with objects often immediately below in display, whether it was the ice cider or the segments of pruned branches. And Gowrie spoke very directly about wanting to push boundaries, the boundaries between the natural and the social, and also the boundaries between natural materials with their tendency to sprout and decay, and synthetic materials that could pursue some of their same values. I think that this kind of richness of edge effect is something that we can appreciate in art. We can appreciate at the edge between art and conservation, and we can see that it is related to another aspect of edge effect too, which is that whether in Carson's shoreline or our Vermont, as I've already said, edges are always moving. They're rich environments, but they're also dynamic and a little hazardous. I've sometimes thought, critters venture into an edge from one habitat looking for life more abundant, but they might well just become lunch, so that's something to remember at our edges. And so just as edges move, art moves too. And the experience of art, I've become convinced, is an experience of movement as much as hiking and forest succession is. I recently watched the dance performance by my Middlebury colleague Andrea Olson that confirmed me in this sense of art, the experience of art as an experience inherently of movement. Of course, dance is on the face of it movement, but in this case, she was presenting her investigations along a series of coastlines in Ireland, France, Florida, and Maine, in which she'd focused particularly on seaweed. And as she danced, her movement evoked a kind of tidal quality. She would surge toward the audience, right up to our feet, and then back in ways that both defined and erased the concept of a shore and called on us to step into the sea for ourselves. I think this is what art does more broadly, not just dance. It encourages us to inhabit moving edges in ways that renew both artistic practitioners and conservationists and their broader communities and audiences in their sense of vital affiliation with the world. Art's liberating potential, as revealed in this exhibition, comes in its ability to open the eyes of our eyes, the hearts of our hearts. In every case, I believe, such impact comes through the experience of movement. The power of poetry comes in the movement of sound, which pulses against the tympanum, amplifying the pulses in our own temples and wrists, and reminds us that language's denotative meaning is just the beginning. In its rhythms, rhymes, and associations, poetic language, offers human subjectivity a surge of entanglement in a larger seaweed-wreathed tide. In gazing into a painting, too, the eye moves from dark to light, from hot to cool, in a swirl of perceptions oriented to shapes we almost recognize. The meaning of visual art incorporates an experience of stepping back and forth as through a mirror, or forward and back in relation to a canvas, making it possible to bring ourselves into focus. In considering such moving edges, it's also important to say something about the seasons that so dramatically inflect our experience of both landscape and art. After all, we are in Vermont, and this is October. With a little luck, we may end up having a spectacular, if compressed, foliage season this year. Though the colors are finally surging up into the mountains, though, by November, most of the leaves will certainly have fallen. That will be a good time to remember Basho's haiku, Kare era ni karasu no tomarikeri, aki no kure. On a barren branch, a crow alights, the end of autumn. That poet's exquisite sensitivity to the seasons finds nothing but moving edges in the world. Autumn for him is not a single season, but rather a succession of transitions and reductions. His focus in the haiku I just read is specifically on the disclosures at autumn's end. The haiku's final word, kure, in addition to connoting in Japanese a dog's tail, might also appropriately be translated in this context, edge. Artists with a tidal or seasonal imagination are naturally inclined to be a little free about rules, grammatical and otherwise. In Basho's haiku, he doesn't actually inflect the verb settles as one would in speech. Instead, he adds to tumaru, the infinitive form meaning to settle, alight, or stop, the non-denotative syllables keri, whose function is purely rhythmic. Their job is to make the leafless bough bounce, as it definitely would after the bumptious arrival of that big corvid. Our own intellectual, physical, and emotional vitality is enhanced to the extent to which we too can bounce with the movement and drama of the world along such a honed edge. Basho wrote in 17th century Japan, at a cultural moment when the austerities of samurai tradition had given way to conspicuous consumption and the lofty ideals of art had been obscured by a taste for gilded decoration. He took to the open road and depicted fleeting but reverberant incidents along the way. His characteristic tone of elegant melancholy reflects the fact that for one who looks closely enough, every natural phenomenon is simultaneously arising and departing. What Wordsworth meant by the phrase, a natural heart, is for this reason one that is perpetually saying goodbye. Such rapt attention to the world is a life-giving antidote, enhancing its preciousness, to the triumphal and self-centered dreams of wealth that are such unwholesome elements of our culture, just as they were of Bashō's Edo-era Japan and Wordsworth's imperial England. Mary Oliver, in her poem, The Summer Day, kneels down in the grass to inspect a grasshopper, as Bashō too would have loved to do. Her poem concludes, "Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your own wild and precious life?" The unique power of art is to bring us back down to earth, to the beautiful seasons of our mortality and the fragile loveliness within which nature and community blossom together. In fact, was it Susan who said what I think is also a Thoreauvian pun? You said, being in nature brings us back to our senses. Somebody just said that, but I liked it, whoever said it. There's always a play of ideas within art's play of color and form, but it's a flicker of appreciation and perception rather than just an abstract or reductionist meaning. It's a lively, ceaseless dialogue between mind and body. In a koan from 7th century China that Bashō might have been familiar with from his own Zen training, a monk tests his teacher by asking, "Is it the flag that moves or the wind that moves?" The reply he receives is, "It is the mind that moves." Art's potential to liberate us from consumerism, defensiveness, and abstraction comes in its ability to get both the body and the mind moving. In this regard, it also addresses the tension between a certain static character to the language of conservation and the ever-changing face of nature. Don't you feel that's a little something funny about the word conservation? Though it's a good thing. Farms and forests, human settlements, and human populations will always be on the move in Vermont. Even the Green Mountains and Lake Champlain have never held still. Despite the ingenious legal apparatus governing the easements and VLT's truly beautiful GIS atlas of conserved lands, the fact remains that conservation, here and everywhere, finally springs from an impulse of hope and expresses itself as an act of faith. Environmental terminology, including environmental itself, often has a pretty short shelf life. As you've been hearing this afternoon, a word I've come to prefer to the standard lexicon of conservation and stewardship is affiliation. It comes from the Latin affiliare, meaning to adopt, and in that sense makes me think of the unpredictableness and preciousness of families. We give ourselves to the land, and we also find ourselves in it. Farming, logging, or hiking, we invest our bodies in nature's flow. Just as at the end of the day, the muddy soles of our boots and the ache in our legs can remind us of the limbs that carried us into the wider world, so too, the human body itself, including the artist's hand, bears the stories of Earth's community of life in the structure of its bones and the chemistry of its blood. Art and the making of art, like farming and forestry, are experiences and not just ideas. Community, like family, is fundamentally a physical experience. Vermont's John Dewey, in his masterpiece, Experience in Nature, defined experience as the active investigation of forces and relationships in the physical world. It was above all a mode of participation, holding an affinity with what Martin Buber was later to call an I-thou perspective. Dewey defined such an approach as, this is his language, a means of penetrating continually further into the heart of nature, another of his phrases, a growing progressive self-disclosure of nature itself. The deepest meaning of conservation for me is claiming such a connection. My friend David Brin has helped me to conceive of such participation as expressing not only human intentions, but also the specific character of our home watersheds. He enjoys applying this sense of connection with local topography to many aspects of human community and economy. The firewood we harvest sustainably and on which many of us rely for heating our homes is an expression for him of northeastern Addison County's five-town woodshed or heat shed. Our surrounding farms and gardens constitute a food shed. He's got me started thinking that the writing produced and produced and read here might fittingly be described as our bookshed. And the wonderful achievements of the 14 artists represented here might also help us to see the featured conserved areas as art sheds. Their projects flow out of local watersheds into a state-scale system of inheritance and creativity. They rise up out of the ground, converge with the diversity of cultural and aesthetic tributaries, then pour themselves into our shared fund of life. Questions, if there are any questions. If you wanted to, please.
Why did you retire?
You know, I've been over for 37 years. So that's answer number one. But it was a dream job. I absolutely loved it. I felt grateful for it. I feel grateful for it still. But I just got to when my wife had retired, so I answered them because I wanted to hang out with my wife more. But really, the silly image I used, I thought it might be a good time to draw a line and then step over and see what was on the other side. So that's it. And so, on the other side, I found more talking and writing. No paycheck. But also a chance to do a little bit of travel, play some more music, attend committee meetings. But it was the dream of a lifetime for me to teach. I loved it. I'm speaking to a Middlebury alumnus here. I would say the same anyway.
Well, they lose a lot when they lose this kind of thing. We need it so badly.
That was great. We're all over here scribbling notes wildly trying to keep up with you. I'm thinking about the whole day. Diversity really seems to be a thing, and thinking about one thing I've noticed about what gives Vermont such beauty is its visual diversity. That in driving down a road in any one kind of vista, you have the road, you have the house, you have maybe a barn, you have mountain, you have so it's like a very varied kind of a landscape here. And thinking about how that diversity was so important during the Depression, like Jonah talked about. But it's like economically, it's not diversity is not helpful economically usually. In terms of what all the models are to keep making more of a mono economy, cash based. This is a hard question, but do you see that? Where do you see that moving in the future for us? We've come away. We're much more cash based certainly than we used to be. But where are we? Kind of straddling.
It's such a rich topic, and I have to say, in terms of formal study, I am innocent of economics, which was a great thing, because when I got married, I said to my wife, you took 3 economics classes, probably you should do taxes. So I've never done taxes, and that was a good thing. I heard a presentation by Professor Erickson from the Gun Center the other day. Yeah. That guy can talk about economics. I haven't met him, but I'd like to hear him again, because he can talk about it in ways that integrate these values of diversity and move beyond macroeconomic verities. And I was thinking, also going back to Donna's comment about that was such a refreshing perspective for me in the Depression in Vermont, that you take a guy like Walter Hart in his book Mountain Township, which is a beautiful little collection. His sense is, if you have a small enough scale, the social and aesthetic diversity are more fully available. Everybody, you've got these types, almost like Commedia dell'arte in the village. They all know each other. And it's true that I think part of the ways in which diversity has served Vermont is that though we obviously have a metropolitan area we're in the middle of here, but a very nice one, but a lot of Vermont is still oriented, a lot of Vermonters are still oriented to the 251 towns. And I was thinking also in terms of the marginal, a lot of these conservation projects are not in the flatlands. They're not in the middle of our best areas. Some are, but a lot of them are on the uplands, and a lot of them are in narrow valleys. So there's a funny way in which the topography and the scale of Vermont make certain kinds of diversity important and also available. And again, as I said, in villages, we live in the middle of the village of Bristol, and have lived there now almost 40 years. And every day we're aware of the people around us with whom, in a virtual community, we might have no contact at all. But people who so enrich our lives and have now done so for decades. So I didn't really answer that, but you encouraged me to.
That's a very big question. That's
Right, no, it's a good, big question to hold on to. Please.
Any of you, have you thought about, do you have an idea of the impact on the culture, the landscape, the land use, the economics of particularly northeastern Vermont and the EB5 visa program?
And the which program?
EB5.
Is that the one that's bringing in industry to
Right.
Newport?
That's the intent,
Yeah, right.
or the stated intent.
Right. I'm no expert in that. I know about it and outline. Do people know about that, where people can get visas if they invest a certain amount of money, and there's a plan
And
for.
provides so many jobs.
Yeah, there's a plan for biotech and other companies coming in, and also for expanded ski resort facilities. I don't know about that one. It's a tricky thing, going back to the earlier parts of today's discussion, because it's good for people to have jobs. And the Northeast Kingdom is an area we know pretty well, and there are a lot of people there who are down on their luck, economically speaking, in that beautiful, beautiful part of the state. So it's appealing to think about ways to have jobs come in. But it's also important to think about the scale of the place and its heritage. It's a fine balance. So again, I'm not being very incisive there. Perhaps somebody else here knows more about this issue. You probably have some thoughts about it. I have a feeling you might. What do you think? You probably know more about this than I do.
I have peripheral concerns about how it shifts the whole landscape and the culture in a really remote area, as much of northeastern Vermont is. By bringing in that much employment and bringing in people from other cultures and countries to do it.
It's interesting, so much of what's been talked about today has been about the processes of rebound or recovery or reaction, which often are inadvertent and gradual. I was thinking about this. I was making a lot of notes today too as we went along. I was thinking about Vermont's rebound in terms of its reputation because of the fact that it was not as directly hit by the Depression because people didn't have much money to start with. And I was thinking about also the process of glacial rebound, after the glaciers lifted that huge weight and sort of the land sort of rebounded from the south. It made all our rivers, not all our rivers, but some rivers flow north. I'm interested, I've sometimes thought as a teacher at Liberal Arts College that the two things all students should be encouraged to think about, going back to Middlebury College, are the reality of unexpected consequences, and another one is the rich meaning of irony. Those two things will take you a long way down the road, but it's true, sometimes plans to enrich ourselves or our communities need to be looked at a little more carefully, because some of the things that are more deeply rooted and more sustainable and more satisfying emerge organically rather than being imposed. But again, I really don't know much about that particular program. Yes.
I just want to add something. I think that neck of the woods up there has held on to that sort of conservative 1930s culture more than the rest of the state. And if you travel up there, you will see that. And
yes.
I think that there is some resistance being met up there with this idea that Northeast Kingdom's going to look like the Champlain Valley, the rest of Vermont. Because you still see a lot of poverty. There's not a lot of jobs, but people hold on to and embrace those self-sufficiency values up there still.
Yeah, it's the most thinly settled, the most old-fashioned, very beautiful. And it's interesting, George Aiken came out. George Aiken plucked out of the air. Isn't that true? The Northeast Kingdom. He said those three northern counties, right? That's the Northeast Kingdom. And I've always thought, what a marketer he was. It's a beautiful phrase for a beautiful area, and one that's fragile. Yeah.
I just want to say, there might be a couple of issues that you're talking about. One is the scale of some of the development. Another, though, about the issue of people coming sort of from outside, and I think Pine Island is a great example of people coming from a very different culture. Where were they from, the Pine Island folks?
Mostly Rwanda and Bhutan.
Yeah, I mean, who have a more affinity to the land than a lot of people in Burlington do, in terms of really understanding how to farm. Or if you get people from Mexico, coming to work as we need them on our farms. I mean, I wish they actually could get some land and settle and farm. They're great farmers. So I think you got to separate maybe the issue of scale versus that whole thing of outsiders. Because we had an influx of outsiders in the 70s. They totally changed the state, but they also were embraced by many of the farmers here and learned, learned real skills on how to be on the land here.
Culture's formed when people meet and exchange stories and images, and arts are part of that. I think that I was part of a project in Starksboro, which is typical, I think, of a lot of Vermont towns in this regard, because you have a big part of the town that are deeply rooted families who've been there, 5 or 6 generations on a single farm. Then you have a lot of newcomers who are moving in, and very typically, when it comes to planning, there's conflict. And so in this project, which was sponsored by the Folklife Center in Middlebury and the Vermont Land Trust, actually, people collected stories in town and shared the stories with the newcomers and the old-timers about what they loved about being in Starksboro. And it really promoted an exchange that I think deepened their possibilities for community in the midst of change. And I do think that art speaks to that, because we were just talking at lunch. Narratives and images help people to find a place for change in their practices, in their hearts, and that's one of the functions of art. Now I'm aware of the fact that we have other questions.
One more question.
Oh, okay.
I had a question. So how has your perspective changed since you worked at Middlebury?
Since I left Middlebury?
Well,
or since I came
or your whole time at Middlebury. How has this your whole thinking? Because I know you're old enough to be through the Vietnam War and whatnot. So how has the perspective changed before or after?
Well, it's interesting. It changed pretty fast, pretty early on, because my wife and I are from Northern California. Before graduate school, we came east to graduate school for a little change. And then I wanted to teach at a liberal arts college. I made a list of fine liberal arts colleges in beautiful places. Middlebury College was #1. They had a job. I got it. I thought, wow, that was pretty good. And so let's go there for 5 years. We agreed. And then my wife, being in special ed, could get a job absolutely anywhere. And so then we'll go back to California. And after about 4 or 5 years, there was no way we could leave. We were just caught by this place. And I think what we liked about it are many of the things we've just talked about. We liked the possibility for small, diverse, rooted communities. We liked being able to live in a village and walk out the back door and see bear tracks about 20 minutes later. There's an unusual juxtaposition of the wild and the settled here. So that brought us in. And since then, as I've become aware of organizations like the Vermont Land Trust, I've come to feel that the quality of conversation, as we've seen all day today, in Vermont is often very high. I'm always coming away from the conversation thinking, wow, another one, where people go take you places with their insights that are very valuable. So I think first the natural qualities of the state grabbed us, then the kind of settlement history and the aspect of settlement, and then the kind of cultural richness. And not to romanticize. I think Vermont faces many challenges, but the resources here. I think the combination of this level of natural quality and beauty and this level of social vitality is not common in the world.
Thank you so much, John.